with SAR-based attestation, ICFR readiness and attest, corporate governance, ERP pre and post-implementation reviews, etc. He has co-authored guidance note on the audit of internal financial controls over financial reporting for ICAI. He is also CISA qualified and a partner in Deloitte's risk advisory function. With this brief introduction, help me in welcoming CA Johar Batriwala. I request Kulshekar to welcome me with a plan. Please, sir. Yeah, please give him a round of applause.
Yes, Tulsi. So very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Johar Batriwala. Glad to be here. Thanks to IASB Chair and ICI for extending the invite. And I just realized walking here that, what could be the most difficult thing after a session post-lunch, It's the second session after post-lunch, where you get a sort of an underhand and you are kind of drowned into philosophy. I'm going to try doing justice to what I know best. My primary area of focus is corporate governance and risk management, so I'll restrict to that. But having said that, I will give you a perspective of when we work on strategic risk mandates with our clients, and when we do internally within our organization also. We also do within our organization. How do we kind of engage with promoter group? And promoter group is a very, very hazy word. How do you define a promoter group, right? Is it a professionally managed organization? Is it a promoter managed organization? And believe me, whether it's a promoter-driven organization or a professionally managed organization, a conversation with the CEO is one of the toughest conversations you will have around risk management. So I don't want to, kind of color the conversation and say that, professionally managed organizations are holier than thou, and, promoter-driven organizations, have a bit of a spot of botheration there. I don't think maybe statistically that's right. We work across the spectrum, so that's my limited 16 years of experience in the profession. I'm going to cover a few important elements here. I'll give you a perspective of how risk management has evolved from our standpoint. We started this journey way back in 2009. We came up with a framework called Risk Intelligence Framework, and we refreshed it last year. And I'll tell you why we refreshed it. Maybe the missing link was the CEO was not getting excited enough with what we were doing. Maybe that's one of the triggering events there. I'll give you some perspective around what we see happening from a volatility and vulnerability standpoint, because risks are not something new. The country, the profession, the companies are facing risks as we speak. But having said that, the speed of onset, the pace at which the risk will come and hit you is significantly changing. It's getting accelerated, and there's a lot of crisis management which one has to do. So I think those are some shades of variation I'll bring about. Then I'll drill down on 4 important themes which I believe would have a meaningful conversation with your promoter, your CEO, or the guy whose neck is going to get squeezed in the board if something goes wrong. Let's be very clear about risk management. If there is one person in the organization who's answerable, is the CEO of that organization. Now, there may be different renditions of that. For a promoter-driven organization, it may be a chairman, which may be called executive or non-executive, doesn't matter. For a professionally managed organization, it might be the CEO. For a quasi-organization, it might be MD come CEO and stuff like that. But there is this one guy who's answerable, and that's the guy with whom you would like to have a conversation and convince him or her in terms of what you have done, and that's for the organization. So I'll drill on 3 or 4 important themes. Let me not, brace the curtains out of the suspense. We will go through it as we move along. And then finally, I'll leave you with a thought of what we see as some of the stress points which organizations are facing and how they are sort of dealing with it. So I think that's some in substance of what I'm going to talk about. Pardon me, I'm not a philosopher like Mr. Shivram. I'll talk some nuts and bolts, but having said that, this is based on what we see in the marketplace. Yeah? I think some of it you are aware, but I'll just build on a few important themes here. Brand is very, very key. Now, again, you can't really distinguish between a promoter-driven organization and a professional organization. Everyone is worried about their brand. Financial losses can be recouped in quarters or years, doesn't matter. I remember when I was baptized by fire 6 years back, I was having a conversation with head of technical services for the largest steel integrated player in the country. And he starts a conversation. We were talking about profitability, we were talking about top line, and he said, business is cyclical. This is my 4th decade in the organization, and I've seen 3 business cycles. So let's not talk about profitability, let's not talk about top line and bottom line. Because commodity business is cyclical, it'll keep changing. Let's talk about brand, because that's far more important. So if you go to any of the large global organizations, a lot of Indian organizations are also global now. Brand is something which is really on top in terms of the risk which they would like to preserve. Second important theme is sustainability. Very, very key in current times, right? You really don't want to operate a plant which is sourcing material which are considered to be conflict minerals. You don't want to source materials from somebody who is employing child labor. You really don't want to do work in a country which is sanctioned by UN. These are very, very topical themes for large organizations. So sustainability has become a very, very key element in all that we do, because larger organizations clearly have a perspective of thinking ahead in decades, right? And sustainability is going to become very, very key. Dovetail it with what's happening from a regulatory standpoint. We have friends from auto side of things here, right? So what's happening in the auto sector, it's all about sustainability, right? Why people are talking about electric powertrain, why people are talking about mobility solutions. It's all to do with sustainability. So if you don't understand that subject, the conversation doesn't really happen. And it's kind of intertwined with what you do from a regulatory standpoint and what you do from organizational ethos standpoint. Volatility, this is very interesting, so I'm sure you have companies where you go, they say that we are doing so well in the Indian market, but when I go to my global counterparts, the damn rupee just keeps depreciating and I'm not able to meet my numbers, right? So this volatility in foreign currency is something which is really impacting a lot of organizations, impacting the investments which are made, around that. Customer centricity, some of you who follow Amazon's success, their flywheel, right? Customer centricity is at the heart of what a lot of organizations are trying to do. And these are not just B2C organizations, these are B2B organizations also, which are really putting the customer at the center of everything and trying to completely recreate their business. So again, that's a topical conversation which one needs to have. Corporate governance, enough has been spoken about this since morning, so I don't really want to labor the point. But again, this is one critical stress point. A lot of organizations are going through that. Cyber, Kodak committee also recognized it. And if you look at the recommendations which came, they talked about cyber being one of the specific inclusions in the charter of what risk management committee needs to look at. And this is dovetailed with what's happening from an industry 4.0 revolution standpoint. Right? So cyber is very, very key if you talk about IoT, when you talk about 3D printing, when you talk about automation of stores or workplace and all of that. Geopolitical, we are all aware of US-China trade war. We are all aware of what's happening from a Brexit standpoint. We are all aware of our government's position in terms of aligning with the trade thing which China is trying to put together. This also has very long-term implications on a lot of businesses. A lot of big businesses are struggling to figure out a sweet spot in terms of the geopolitical equation. And then, of course, how do you extend your program to third parties, right? Because you have to look at a program throughout the extended value chain. If you look at it internally within the organization, everything looks great. But if you want to do justice to sustainability, you have to go back to suppliers. You have to go back to distributors. Right? If your distributor has a problem with EHS compliances, it becomes your problem all of a sudden, because nobody reports in a press that this particular distributor defaulted. They will say that this was a Maruti distributor, or he was this distributor or that distributor, and that's how the press hammers you, right? Now I'll give you a very, very intuitive view of how a promoter would want to look at their risk universe. This is very interesting. You will find it very intuitive, very easy to apply. You can bucket all your entire risk universe into 3 broad, circles or categories. One is a self-inflicted risk. Any guess what could be these kinds of risks? is a self-imposed risk, right? I had a very clear operating policy. Take, for example, I'll stay with that. Some other speaker talked about KYC. If you don't do a proper job of that, and you get a rogue customer in or a rogue supplier in, you might be looking at a self-inflicted risk. So organizations which have been around for decades together, and some of them have been around for centuries together also, they clearly have absolutely fantastic operating processes, but still they get exposed because they don't do justice of self-inflicted risk. Now, think ahead. Do you think this is something which a promoter will engage with you or a CEO will engage with you in a conversation? If you start your conversation with a self-inflicted risk, perhaps it could be a non-starter. Because as far as they are concerned, they have done the investment in technology, they have done the investment in people, they are operating it for decades together, and still the organization is getting exposed. So they would just try to figure out which neck to squeeze and then move on. So self-inflicted risk is not something which really excites the CEO of an organization. Let me put it that way. The next one is the imposed risk. The typical examples of what's happening from a regulatory standpoint, be it about first-use plastic, be it about electric powertrain, be it about what's happening from a data privacy standpoint within the country. All these are very clear examples of some key risks, regulatory risks, which is going to hit the industry, and these will be imposed on you. You will not get time to respond. The only solace that you will have is everyone else is impacted, but that doesn't help you. Right? Maybe everyone else thought about it 5 years back and they already have a countermeasure which they don't talk about in public. So self-imposed risk is something which the CEO would be very keen to understand. And here there is no right and wrong. It's more about how do you perceive the future. 18 months hence, 24 months hence, 36 months hence, right? So that's the real thing. And I'll go back to Shivram's presentation where he talked about anticipation. That's where the key anticipation comes in, where you will talk about that. The last one is the most interesting one, which is a calculated risk. A corporate strategy is always a balance between a risk and reward equation. This is the one which the promoter is most keen on listening from you. Where we went right, where we went wrong, what is the root cause of that. So if you want to do justice to this, you need to do justice to the corporate strategy. If you are not invited to the strategy table from an outside perspective, very difficult to get into a conversation and talk about risks around strategy. So why you get invited to the table is if you are able to demonstrate that level of understanding and you are willing to kind of, have a bit of a haziness in your role, that should I be talking strategy or should I completely stay outside this, because this is a clear management function and as an internal auditor or as a CRO, I don't want to venture into that. So I think this is thin ice, to put it mildly, but need of the hour. I talked about, we started our journey in 2009 and last year we came up with a new framework. And I'll just quickly talk about that new framework. At the top is the governance framework. Is it really important for a CEO to worry about a governance framework or a promoter to worry about a governance framework? Or do you think they don't care? I would say, I take your point, so they would like to see compliance, but do they really worry about governance in true sense? Let's say, not just in letter, but in spirit also.
Not really.
Well, I mean, think of it. If you are running a multi-billion-dollar organization, somewhere you need to trust people, right? Somewhere you need to put that operating model, call it governance, call it whatever name or nomenclature you want to give it, whatever taxonomy you want to use it. But the fact of the matter is, even in promoter-driven organization, you will find business unit heads which are highly empowered. You will find functional heads who are highly empowered, because you really can't run a multi-billion-dollar organization by not trusting people. Where do you trust people, right? You trust people here by setting up a governance framework. Now, I completely take your point that there could be a conscious override. That's the risk I think we were talking about in the earlier session. But stating that they don't really care about it or they don't invest time and energy in this may not really be reflective of the current ground realities. Yeah? Because they are successful organizations. The nimbleness with which they take decisions is far better than professionally driven organizations because they take the bets. Now, they have a governance framework where, I'll go back to Shivram's presentation, their risk appetite is much higher. That's their management philosophy. One cannot find fault with the philosophy, because we are trying to color people in terms of promoters and non-promoters. Yeah. The second is a system which is more. Yeah.
Down somewhere, Trojan horse giving all the information to the promoter, and that's very common.
Yeah. I would maybe let me use a slightly better way of stating this. A lot of companies have shadow boards, right? I'm sure you would have heard about this. Some people call it shadow boards, then they realize that it's not a great name to have, then they call it advisory boards, right? Now, yes, companies have it. Yes, those people advise on strategy, they advise on brand, they advise on customer centricity, they advise on key regulatory matters. They are the ones who practically influence the CEO in terms of his or her decision making. It's very important to understand that, and yes, that construct will continue. Why do we have pre-audit committees, right? All of you attend those, isn't it? It's not that you're trying to game the system, it's not that you want to make the audit committee very ritualistic, but the point is you have finite time. Now you have a very, very bright person who's willing to participate with you in your strategy building, but he is not okay with the risk and rewards of an independent board member. How do you onboard that person is the question, right? So it's like you can call it glass half full or glass half empty. I think that's a choice we need to make. But I think that's the reality of many organizations now. And when you get to the org structure and you have a deeper question with the CFO, that, okay, who are the guys your CEO listens to, he'll tell you. And they may not even be in the org structure. I completely agree. That's quite possible. Yeah?
So my question was more about, when you talk about ERM framework, governance framework, it will be a documented framework, right? There will be role and responsibility, some organization. And there are some other people, who are giving the information to the promoter. But ultimately, the person who are named in the governance framework, they are the ones who are held responsible because they are the signatories. And as an internal auditor, you might already know that, these are not the right people. But it makes your life very difficult, in terms of who should be, who should you hold responsible, who should you follow up with, and that is where maybe because you have worked so much with promoters, maybe your advice is. Yeah.
I think I'll go back to my first hypothesis. The one guy who's answerable to the board is the CEO. So wherever you believe there is haziness in terms of who takes the ownership, it gets automatically delegated upwards.
Johar, I think see what I think Naval is alluding to, and what I think I would also like to get maybe your perspective. The governance framework, there's a formal and an informal. The formal is what's there in the books and whatever, but then the informal is based on the power centers. The power centers may be very different than what's there on the books, which is what complicates the whole situation.
Sure, okay. So I'll answer the question directly. As far as enterprise risk management is concerned, we do not confine ourselves to the formal defined governance framework. What works for the organization is the one that you need to look at. If there is a chief of staff or the CEO and he has the ears of the CEO, he's the key guy for us to map, right? He may not even be coming in the org structure in a fancy manner. He might be coming 5 levels down, but he might be the boss of all the people who are nicely projected in the second layer, right? So I think that's how one has to look at it. Yeah. Now, if you look at the operating part of how you look at risk management, you can intuitively break it down into two. One is the operational discipline, and I'll bring it back, in terms of the self-inflicted risks. This is the operational discipline of how you run an organization. The second is successfully delivering the change. These are the mega projects which Shivram talked about. These are the key strategic bets which the organization is kind of, placing, and they are progressing forward. Now, let me overlay this with a promoter versus professionally managed organization. In a professionally managed organization, operational discipline would be a very, very heavy bucket for you. because local guys are really not empowered to take the key strategic bets. But these two things would still exist. Whereas in a promoter-driven organization, this would be slightly heavier compared to operational discipline because they are very nimble in terms of decision making. But both of them coexist. Their importance in the organization is, slightly vary. The last one is very, very key, which is about crisis. And I think Shivram talked about it very nicely. That's the first thing he started with. What if the risk really hits you? Or what if the risk is just about to hit you? What's your level of preparedness? Now again, that's something, a promoter would be very, very keen, the CEO would be very, very keen to kind of understand and engage in a conversation. I said that I'll build on 3 or 4 themes which excites a promoter, a CEO, whichever name you want to call it. The first one is discussion around strategy. This is the first thing which has to be brought into the conversation. Anything on operational discipline will not really excite. You really need to go back to strategy and talk about it. There are 2 build-outs of a strategy. The first one is risk-off strategy and risk-to strategy. Risk-off strategy is your more execution risk around strategy. And risk-to strategy is it the right strategy in the first place, right? Now all your wisdom about the regulatory environment, the operating environment, all your wisdom about what has worked in the past, not worked in the past, what are the fundamental assumptions based on which the strategy is built out, are not out of bounds as far as we as either internal auditors or risk professionals are concerned. We may not have the wisdom of the BCGs or McKinseys of the world, but that doesn't matter. I don't think that's the need. The idea here is you are not trying to build a strategy. The strategy is given. Now you want to understand what are the assumptions based on which the strategy is built out. You can validate those. What are the approximations which are built out? What kind of an operating structure is chosen for that strategy to be successful? These are the areas which one can critique and come up with some topical, issues, areas around risk where we can engage with the organization. Another very important and related thing about risk management and strategy is how do you, take care of your competitive advantage, right? A strategy is built to, have a better competitive advantage compared to the operating environment within which you are operating and compared to your peer group. But peer group also is not enough. You need to look at your analogs. That is there some disruption which is going to come my way and disrupt me as an organization. Now, classic case in point is mobility may disrupt auto companies, may disrupt smart cities, may disrupt insurance companies. So you really need to worry about those analogs which might come and hit you as well. So understanding of your competitive advantage is very, very key if you are able to do justice to a conversation around strategy, of that particular entity. The next one is around crisis. We have sort of talked about this. I'll not labor the point too much, but the idea is that risks do materialize. And when they materialize, so take for example, you had a problem with NPA. And then there is a regulatory inspection which happens, and then it becomes settled that yes, you had a big problem with lack of adequate disclosure on NPAs or the quantum of NPAs which you were carrying. Now a risk which you had perhaps identified and you had an operating discipline around it materialized for you. And now that it has materialized, you have to deal with it in a very, very different manner. You need to involve your PR strategy. You need to involve your strategy around how do you protect your brand. You need to involve your sort of what we loosely call it as a crisis playbook to really do the complete simulation, walk the whole 9 yards in terms of how do I in this times of crisis, not get my brand impaired? How do I, not have too much of a financial impact? And how do I go back to business as usual? How do I go out of the front page of Economic Times and get into the 6th page and then finally go out of Economic Times? That's in a nutshell is a strategy when you are impacted by a crisis. And crisis, the direct impact of crisis is about your brand. Brand then cascades into corporate governance. Then it raises a question on your operating model. So it has a cascading, it has a domino kind of an effect. So crisis has to be dealt with it in a very, very separate and a different manner. This is just an overall blown version of what you need to do from a crisis standpoint. The other thing we talked about brand, I've given some examples. I'll not get into very specifics here. But the key thing is how the organization is not only preserving their brand, but how the organization is building their brand also. Because oftentimes, when a crisis hits you, what really keeps you in a good stead is the brand that you have earned, the reputation which you have earned over past several decades. Right? So a brand requires nurturing, it requires constant investment. And if your industry is getting disrupted, you need to create a different halo around your brand, because the traditional view of your brand will not really create the market impact, will not really brings customer to the table. So from that standpoint also, one has to look at it both from a brand protection perspective and brand building perspective. So I think that's again a very important conversation related to multiple other areas. This is the last slide I have. These are some of the topical themes. Every year we kind of do an outside-in perspective of what we believe corporates are, struggling with, or what are the stress points around overall risk management. This is a sum and substance of what we see. The first one is future of work, where a lot of disruptions are happening around people strategy. What work is, what is workforce, and where work has to be delivered. There are a lot of disruptions which are happening, and which tends itself to reskilling imperative. We talked about, Shivram talked about it in the prior session also. Then you have extended enterprise. We talked about sustainability. We talked about supply chain, right? So that's again one of the very important themes. The third one is digital technology risk. This is no longer a proof of concept. A lot of industries are seeing a big onslaught of digital technologies, which are really impacting their day-to-day operations, and we really need to do justice in terms of our overall risk portfolio and how do we address those risks. And then of course a portfolio view of your risks insofar as your strategy is concerned, right? You really need to get down to your business units. I'm sure a lot of you belong to conglomerates. It's not just one entity sitting within one legal entity. There are multiple avatars of the organization. You might be in B2B, B2C, you might be in government contracts, right? So all the three business units have very different risks and rewards, very different asset allocation, very different profitability, very different operating dynamics, right? So if that's the case, you really need to get down to the asset level, to the specific portfolio level, and then sort of do justice around this. So I think that's pretty much what I had from my side. As I promised, it will be very different from what Shivran talked about. Maybe we are like chalk and cheese, but ICAI is known to put two people together with very different thoughts, very different views. So thanks a lot for your patient hearing. Sorry, I've been a little under weather, so thanks for being very patient with me. If we have time, happy to take questions, or I don't want to be the guy between your tea breaks, so I'm fine either ways. Any questions?
I thank you for guiding us with a practitioner's perception on risk management. I request CA Savitrao to present the memento to CA Johan. With a big round of applause, please welcome CA Savitrao.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We will now break for a 10-minute. We will now break for a 10-minute tea break. I request you all to please don't go away.